Hey there. So the podcast is currently on an extended hiatus so that I can write my next book and work on some other exciting projects. But while we're away, I hope you'll enjoy this fan favorite episode from the archives. If you want brand new content to help you make peace with food and heal from diet culture, come sign up for my free weekly newsletter at christyharrison.com/newsletter, where I answer a weekly listener question. And as always, if you join my Intuitive Eating Fundamentals course at christyharrison.com/course, you get access to our exclusive monthly Q&A podcast where I answer all your new questions. Just go to christyharrison.com/newsletter and christyharrison.com/course to sign up, or click the links in the episode description. Welcome to Food Psych, a podcast about intuitive eating, health at every size, body liberation, and taking down diet culture. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and I'm an anti-diet registered dietitian, certified intuitive eating counselor, and author of the book Anti-Diet: Reclaim Your Time, Money, Well-Being, and Happiness Through Intuitive Eating, which is available wherever books are sold. Join me here every week as I interview interesting people from all different backgrounds about their paths toward peace with food in their bodies. And by the way, on this show, we bleep out diet culture stuff like weight and calorie numbers, but we don't censor swear words or other adult language, so listener discretion is advised.
Anti-diet revolution, we're for health at every size. Eat the foods you like. Food Psych.
Hey there, welcome to episode 240 of Food Psych. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and today I'm talking with fellow Health at Every Size dietitian Erica Leon about intuitive eating in midlife and menopause, why people are particularly vulnerable to diet culture during perimenopause, the importance of normalizing body changes throughout the life cycle, how Erica transitioned her own work from weight-centric to weight-inclusive, and so much more. I can't wait to share our conversation with you in just a moment. This is one that was recorded before the pandemic, so you won't hear us talk about that in the call, and that is why. But this week's listener question is much more recent. It's from a listener named Caroline who writes, "Hi, Christy. Thank you so much for the work you do. I'm a big fan of your podcast, and after years of dieting, have been working on intuitive eating for about a year and have seen a lot of improvements in my health since I just focused on stopping my diet binge cycle, and I'd been feeling the best I'd felt in years. However, like many people, I'm sure, I've been deeply upset and scared by the frequent reports of a link between higher weights and negative COVID-19 outcomes. I so appreciate the work you've been doing, but as I'm sure you know, you're one of the only voices fighting against this idea. It doesn't help that it seems like in many articles I see about younger people dying of COVID, the picture shows someone in a larger body. Anyway, while I know logically there are probably many people in larger bodies who've survived COVID, it's scary to only see examples of negative outcomes. I know this is because people recovering don't make the news, but still. Perhaps this is too much to ask, but I was wondering if you knew of any HAES-friendly communities, online most likely, to connect with people in a similar boat to me. I feel so alone, and I'm hoping that might be a way to maybe hear of people in larger bodies who've had the virus and were fine. I totally understand if this isn't something you can help with, and either way, I want to thank you for the work you do and tell you what a rare comfort it's been to me in this scary time. Thank you and be well." So thanks, Caroline, for that great question. And before I answer, just my usual disclaimer that these answers and this podcast in general are for informational and educational purposes only and are not a substitute for individual medical or mental health advice. So thank you for your question and thank you for your kind feedback, Caroline. And I just want to send so much empathy and compassion to you because I know it's got to be so hard and so scary to see people who look like you being used to illustrate stories of COVID-19, being used as the picture, the supposed picture of COVID-19. And really, you're right that there are far too few of us pushing back on this messaging. There definitely are a number of us, I think, working behind the scenes to dismantle this supposed science, connecting higher BMI and COVID-19, including some of the founders of HAES and fat activists who've been doing this work for decades. And I'm part of a working group now I just joined of scientists and fat studies scholars and activists who are working on a scientific response to this. So that's pretty cool. But I know it seems like such a drop in the bucket compared to what we're seeing in the media every single day. And I know that because I still have Google alerts, all the Google alerts I set up when I was writing my Wired op-ed. I keep them going and I see all of the shitty articles that are coming out every day in the media, and also the PubMed alerts that I have, which show wild speculation in the pages of scientific journals. And it's really just astounding how much of this content there is coming out all the time. But I want to help you put that into perspective. So in addition to giving you some ideas for online communities where you can find other higher weight people talking about this stuff like you asked, I also just want to step back and give you some historical context to help you see that this framing of higher weight as a COVID risk factor is really nothing new. And it's just an extension and a new version of what we're always fighting against here, which is diet culture and specifically medical fat phobia, which is the way that it shows up in the medical community. And that medical fat phobia really is awful and not okay, and we need to change it. But, it's also really to be expected, given that we live in diet culture, where the assumption is that fatness makes people unhealthy. That assumption has been the case for more than a century now, because by the 1920s, diet culture was already really entrenched in both the medical field and in society at large. It started to get entrenched in the late 1800s, really took root in the medical field in the early 1900s. And it's only gotten more and more deeply embedded as the decades have gone by. So the, idea that weight is a cause of poor health did not always exist, right? It's a relatively new phenomenon, but it has been the case and pretty entrenched in medicine for the last 100 years. And so that's a lot to undo. And so by the time the fat liberation movement was born, which was in the early 1970s, hard to believe that's almost 50 years ago now, right? But that it's been almost 50 years. So almost probably I would say like a third of the time that diet culture has been around, have we had any sort of concerted effort to fight back against it in the form of fat liberation. By the time that happened in the early 1970s, the medical mistreatment of larger bodied people was already endemic to society, particularly in the US. And the movement was created in large part to tackle these issues of unequal access to healthcare and harmful treatment of larger bodied people. And that was going on even back then. So we'll link to the Fat Liberation Manifesto in the show notes for this episode, because I think it's really interesting to read and to see for yourself how they were addressing these issues even then. And I know we've talked about that manifesto on the podcast before, but it's really interesting because it's the root of what we do here in so many ways. Because the Health at Every Size movement was born out of connections and collaborations between fat liberation activists and healthcare providers who were understanding their cause and wanted to fight back against medical fat phobia and offer an alternative to the harm that was being done in the name of healthcare. And remember, that was almost 50 years ago that the fat liberation movement was born, and fat liberation activists and their allies have been fighting this fight ever since. And things did actually start to seem more hopeful for a time in the early to mid 1990s. As I describe in the first chapter of my book, Anti-Diet, people were getting the message that diets really don't work, that the diet industry is failed and flawed, and that we need to step away from it and do something else. So it kind of seemed like things were turning, right? That the scientific evidence was so undeniable that people were going to have to start moving away from diets en masse. But then what happened was the diet industry brought out the big guns. It started labeling larger body size as a supposed epidemic. And that really further entrenched the diet industry again. It brought it back and gave it a new lease on life, really. And fat liberation and Health at Every Size advocates have had to fight even harder ever since, because now most of the medical industry is really in lockstep with painting fatness as a disease in a way that's totally unjustified. And again, I discuss this in my book in the first two chapters. And so I wanted to bring up all that historical context, which I think is really important because with that context, we can see that now in 2020, in this cultural moment where a growing number of people are questioning the conventional wisdom on weight and health and coming over to the anti-diet and HAES paradigm, diet culture denizens have a real vested interest in trying to maintain control. And I think they're really seizing on very early stage, poor quality research that doesn't control for important confounding variables like weight stigma, weight cycling, poor quality of care in the ER, and stuff like that, and using that to make a case that higher weight is a risk factor for this scary disease. And I think this is just another effort by the diet industry and the researchers and doctors that it pays handsome sums of money to in the form of consulting fees and research grants and all of this other stuff to maintain its stranglehold on the medical field and to stamp out the flames of the anti-diet and fat-positive movement that threatens its bottom line. So we can't let them do this. We have to fight back and stop this unjustified blaming of body size, or we'll be digging our healthcare system and our culture as a whole out of this fat-phobic mess of beliefs for even longer. So I want to call on everyone listening to this who has any sort of platform to talk about this issue and to keep talking about it and to keep questioning the supposed link between higher body weight, higher BMI, and poor health outcomes with COVID-19, and to push back against the diet culture forces that are trying to harness shaky science about the so-called risks of high BMI in order to shore up their hold on the healthcare system and on the hearts and minds of the public. We have to push back. And I think my Wired article critiquing this supposed science on COVID-19 and weight was a helpful start. But, it doesn't say everything and it doesn't go far enough, right? We need more people talking and writing about this and doing it constantly to help keep up with the flow of crap that's coming out in the media. Because the more media and researchers just writing letters to the editor of scientific journals spout off about this, the more it's going to start to seem like conventional wisdom. And therefore, the more larger-bodied people are going to feel stigmatized and shamed and worried and scared like you're feeling in a way that's unnecessary because we actually don't have the science to support that theory right now. We just have, some very early stage preliminary data that doesn't actually explain why we might be seeing higher BMI as a so-called risk factor in certain groups of people. By the way, not across the board, right? Because people over age 65 seem to be totally fine, if not even slightly protected by having a larger BMI, a higher BMI, according to some of this preliminary evidence, right? So it's really not cut and dried. And as I explained in the Wired piece, and as I talked about here a few weeks back, this research is really in its early stages, in its infancy, I would say. And it's not going to be until years from now that we're going to be able to look back and tease apart what was actually going on. But if we take the case of swine flu or H1N1 as an example, it looked in the early stages of the research like, oh my God, higher BMI is a risk factor. And there was all this media, again, trumpeting that, and people were making a big deal of that. And then meta-analysis years after the fact showed that actually no, when you controlled for quality of care that higher BMI people were experiencing, any association with worse health outcomes in H1N1 disappeared because it was the quality of care. It was the lower quality care, the less attentive medical care that higher weight people were getting that could explain the difference in their health outcomes. And I think that's really what we're going to see here. So I've been talking a lot about my Wired piece here, and I really think that that is an important read for anyone who's concerned about this stuff. It was published on April 17th, but there isn't any quote-unquote new science that contradicts what I said there. All of those points still hold. And of course, I'm recording this about a week and a half before the episode is set to air, but still, all of those points are valid. All of those points are things we need to consider in any new research or reporting about the research that comes out. And I think one really important thing to note is that in that piece, I talk about how in a lot of the public health data, the percentages of larger bodied people who are in the hospital or the ICU with COVID really mirror the percentage of larger bodied people in the overall population, meaning that there are actually thousands upon thousands of larger bodied people who've had this disease and been just fine. And in fact, in certain places, as I discussed in the piece, I talked about Louisiana and its statistics showing that higher weight people are actually less likely to die from COVID-19 than the percentage that's in the population. There's like 15% fewer people dying of COVID-19 in larger bodies than we would expect given their presence in the population. So that really indicates, going back to your question, Caroline, that there are actually thousands upon thousands of larger bodied people who've had this disease, because there are thousands upon thousands of folks in larger bodies in the population, right? And ended up just fine. It's not the death sentence it's made out to be. And I personally know a few of those folks, right? A few folks in larger bodies who've had it and ended up fine, or, maybe one who's gone to the hospital and had some complications, but still ended up fine, right? Didn't end up dying. And I know many of my friends and colleagues know folks in this boat too. And, the people that I know who have passed away from this have all been in smaller bodies. So that's anecdotal evidence, but I think it's helpful maybe just to push back on some of this fear that you have, Caroline, from reading these articles, because those can make it feel like nobody who's larger bodied ever survives this or something, and that's just not true. And of course, as I said in the Wired piece and have said here a number of times as well, if there is any excess risk that seems to be linked to higher BMI, it probably has more to do with weight stigma and quality of care or lack thereof, and with other confounding factors, than it does with body size itself. Body size itself is not to blame for this. What's more, the weight stigma and quality of care issues that I mentioned in that piece are really just the tip of the iceberg. And I think we're going to see a lot more explanations coming out over the coming months and years that have nothing to do with body size, but with how larger bodied people are treated in our healthcare system. For example, some of my colleagues have pointed out that many higher weight people in the ICU are likely getting underfed because of this bullshit notion that they should be placed on a calorie-restricted diet, which unfortunately some doctors and dietitians still believe, even though the more current thinking and research really indicates that you should never let people lose weight when they're in the hospital, no matter where they fall on the weight spectrum, because that's a sign of malnutrition, and malnutrition results in worse health outcomes like greater secondary infections and poorer healing times and things like that. So I hope that helps give you a little bit of context to understand this supposed research. And then in terms of your question about resources and communities to join, there are definitely lots of them out there. I think the easiest way to start is probably to look up the phrase fat positive on Facebook and do like a group search for that. You can find lots of groups. And I think putting fat positive in the search field is helpful because, groups don't call themselves fat positive unless they are, right? There might be some fake ones out there, but I think that's kind of a robust search term. And look for the groups that have really robust community agreements that you have to agree to before joining, including stating that intentional weight loss talk is prohibited in this group, that abuse of any kind in the group, including racism, homophobia, fat phobia, etc., will not be tolerated, and that people will be kicked out if they violate the group agreements. Having robust agreements like that is helpful because it tells you that the group is as safe as possible and that the moderators are really looking out for the most marginalized people in that group. Also, I would recommend checking out the group Caring for Our Fat Bodies, also a Facebook group. I don't love Facebook, by the way, so it kind of pains me to recommend Facebook groups, but a lot of organizing, a lot of good resources are happening in Facebook groups. So Caring for Our Fat Bodies, I think, is a good one. It's about physical self-care and hygiene, but I'm sure it probably also has some stuff about COVID-19 right now. I don't know for sure, actually, because I can't be a part of that group as a thin person. It's only for people who identify as fat. But I think have a hunch that it would be a good place to look. So I hope that helps, Caroline. And thank you again so much for your question. I know this is a scary time, but I'm just hoping to give you some reassurance that you don't need to worry. You don't need to blame yourself for your body size. And you certainly don't need to diet or try to lose weight, because no matter whether or not higher weight is a risk factor for COVID-19, there's absolutely no evidence showing that intentional weight loss is helpful for this virus. And in fact, we have a lot of evidence that suggests that depriving yourself and being malnourished and weight cycling actually results in a worse immune system, a worse prognosis for people who have diseases like COVID-19 or anything else. And that a far better approach is really just to take care of yourself in a way that doesn't involve trying to shrink your body. So thanks again, Caroline. And if anyone else wants to submit your own question for a chance to have it answered on an upcoming episode, you can go to christyharrison.com/questions. That's christyharrison.com/questions. And then if you want to ask me all your questions and have me answer them for you every month, you can come join my online course, Intuitive Eating Fundamentals. The course has a monthly Q&A podcast that I do just for course participants. And of course, the course also has lots of great content, 13 juicy modules teaching you the principles of intuitive eating, and a private community forum that is just for course participants so that you can have daily guidance from hundreds of great people who are in that course, along with support from me and my team. If you're ready to break free from diet culture and reclaim the life it stole from you, learn more and sign up for the course at christyharrison.com/course. That's christyharrison.com/course. This episode of Food Psych is brought to you by BetterHelp Online Counseling. I love BetterHelp because they make therapy accessible and affordable for people all over the world. And in times like this, having access to a good therapist is more important than ever. BetterHelp offers licensed professional counselors who specialize in depression, anxiety, relationships, disordered eating, and lots of other issues. I shared last week that my anxiety has been kicking up a notch because of COVID-19, and I've started seeing a BetterHelp therapist to help process it. I just had my first session with her, and she was so great at bringing a compassionate and trauma-informed perspective to the table, which I think is so important for anyone who's gone through trauma, so that I felt really supported and heard and had a real reduction in my anxiety. When you sign up with BetterHelp, they assess your needs and match you with a therapist in your area. They're able to make a successful match right off the bat most of the time, but if you start the process and you find that your counselor just isn't a good fit for you, BetterHelp makes it easy to change to a new one so that you can find the right therapeutic connection and work on the things you really need help with. Food Psych listeners can get a free 7-day trial when you go to betterhelp.com/Christy. That's betterhelp, HELP.com/CHRISTY for a 7-day free trial to find a great therapist now. And now, without any further ado, let's go to my conversation with Erica Leon. So tell me about your relationship with food growing up.
That's an interesting question. I think that my relationship with food was really very normal growing up, I think until high school. I don't think I really thought about it. You know what? As I'm saying that, I'm changing my mind. I'll tell you when when it really changed was when I was 10. I never really thought about my food at all. But when I was 10, I had a very traumatic incident, and I think that's probably why I forgot about it initially, is I went to ballet class. I loved ballet. And I can remember particularly one moment when the ballet teacher stopped the class. I was doing some sort of dance move across the floor. And the dance teacher, Miss Chris, said to me in front of the whole class, you know, Erica, you're really good. You could be a really good ballet dancer, but you have to stop eating all those sweet foods and cakes and cookies. And honestly, I just forgotten about that until this moment. I was just floored. And I went home. I remember just crying and saying, I'm never going to go back. And, you know, my mother was wonderful. But I think what happens is I had early puberty. And it's very normal. You know, girls gain some additional weight around puberty. And of course, over the next several years, my body changed, and there was no question about my size or any issue whatsoever. But I think I started to restrict my food a little bit, not a lot, but a little. And I think in high school, I restricted it more. And in particular, when my father died very suddenly when I was a senior in high school. So there was quite a bit of trauma as I'm remembering. And I just have to say that it's just luck that I didn't have a very severe restrictive eating disorder. I restricted for a little bit and then fortunately went off to college sort of away from the sadness in my house. But that was, I think those two episodes really affected and influenced my body, you know, how I felt about my body and how I felt about my food.
I can imagine. Yeah, that sounds really painful and traumatic, both of those things. And it sounds like you had sort of a protective shield in a way with your mom. It sounds like she was able to help you not fall so deeply into the restrictive element.
Yeah, no, my mom was really wonderful. I mean, there was always a lot of diet talk in my house. I'm 60. And when I grew up, there was all this, it was Weight Watchers going on. And there was not just Weight Watchers, but it was Jean Nidich in her living room. My mother was certainly on a variety of diets at that point. and Atkins and the Scarsdale diet. And so I definitely heard that stuff growing up. But my mother, in terms of how she raised, there were three of us, the food was really pretty normal. I mean, even after that horrible incident when I was 10, she really did protect and made us feel really, us, my brother and my sister, really good about ourselves. But I think when my father died was really very sudden, sort of all bets were off. And I think that she was sort of on in her own grieving. And I think what really protected me was going off to college and just being with a new set of friends and having new concerns, adjusting to college life. So that part was, I have to say, thank God, I was lucky.
Yeah. And so the restriction didn't get worse then. It kind of went away for a while.
No, it went away. Absolutely. I didn't even realize that it was restriction until becoming an eating disorder dietitian and sort of doing this work. I'd never even thought about it. But looking back at that period of time, I definitely lost my period for a little while. I was very, very obsessed and sort of counting calories and points and thinking about my body. And it just, honestly, it just disappeared as soon as I went to college and was off doing my own thing. So I say thank God for that.
Do you think the counting calories and, obsessing about your eating was a response to the trauma of your father's death? Was it kind of like something to do to take your mind off things?
It was definitely a response to the trauma. I've since really understood that. And again, it lasted a very short time, but it was just an interesting, I guess, a safe way to protect myself. Trauma is fascinating. It's really fascinating how it manifests itself.
And yeah, that it kind of got caught up so quickly in diet culture rules and restrictions too, that it wasn't just sort of like not eating because of grief, which a lot of us experience, I think, is, a reduction in appetite when we're grieving, and then it roars back once we're sort of feeling better. But it wasn't just that. It was all the thoughts and behaviors too of diet culture.
It absolutely was diet culture. Again, I've thought about this a lot. I've had a lot of years to think about this and really reflect back on that time of life. And I mean, I just can remember in high school, just all of my friends talking about being on diets, playing around with diets. I can remember even some of the crazy foods that I brought for lunch on some of the meals that we had, over those 4 years. And so definitely there were the diet culture rules, but I think it just, again, came to a head when my father died. And thank goodness that I didn't stick around. Thank goodness I went away.
You got out of that environment.
I did.
And so in college, your friends were less caught up in diet culture, it sounds like?
Well, what's interesting, I was a nutrition major at college, but it really wasn't about being a diet culture. My friends were in a wide variety of majors, psychology and other sciences, architecture, engineering, what the whole gamut. I went to Cornell, and I just had a lot of friends in different programs. So my becoming a nutrition major, it's so interesting. It really wasn't about diet culture. It was really about finding my way to liking the way the human body worked and understanding the science as I understand it now. And yeah, when I went away to college, the legal drinking age wasn't 21, it was 18. So, there was a lot of fun being had. And no, we were not thinking about diets. We were just thinking about fun. I just say, thank goodness.
Yeah. Wow. It's very different, I think, in a lot of colleges these days.
It certainly is. I see that from my own kids' colleges, where the drinking age being 21, it's a whole different ball game. And that's a whole nother conversation. But yeah, no, but a lot of fun was being had, which is really, when I think about it, remarkable that I went to Cornell and, life there was really just about studying. So it was kind of like study hard, play hard. I think those were our rules. Yeah.
How did you get interested in being a nutrition major? You said it was kind of being attracted to the science. So there wasn't any sort of effort at like shrinking your own body or having it be, the rules and restrictions that you had engaged in before weren't in your mind when you chose that.
Yeah, I think honestly, I was lost when I went away, and I was in the College of Human Ecology at Cornell, which is sort of life sciences, and there was a psychology component. So I was actually a psychology major for a few years, and I really enjoyed that, but I didn't really understand or see what I was going to do with that information. And so I just on a whim took a nutrition course, and I just was immediately taken. I fell in love. I remember the instructor, one of the things that she said in the first days of the class was, she came in and said, I just had the most fantastic breakfast. I had pizza, and it had all the food groups. Her name was Dr. Marge Devine. May she rest in peace. But I remember she really influenced me, thinking that's a great breakfast. And so yeah, my interest was mostly in the science and the chemistry. It wasn't about shrinking our bodies. It was thinking, wow, this biology is very fast. It's fascinating. And I ended up thinking that I was going to be a doctor. I was a pre-med. And so I worked over a couple of summers at a hospital. And that was my intended course, was going to be going to medical school. So it really wasn't about shrinking our bodies. It was much more about the science and physiology. It was hard. It was interesting and hard. Oh my God, but that hard.
I bet. Yeah. What made you shift course and decide to become a dietitian instead of a doctor?
I think what happened is the trauma caught up with me, and I just was very unsure. Even though I had this thought in my head that I should be a doctor, I think I became very nervous and anxious and thinking this maybe I wouldn't be good at it. What was going to happen? I was going to kill people. I mean, I really had these crazy thoughts as I remember back then. And so I kind of thought, let me see. I'll do a dietetic internship and I'll go and I'll see what it's like to be in a hospital. Maybe I'll change my mind. And I actually loved being a dietitian, and that sort of set the stage for the next part of my career. I said, here I am. I'm already working as a dietitian. Let me just keep doing this. It feels close enough to medicine. So that's really what changed. And it really wasn't about shrinking the body. It was about understanding and enjoying the physiology of what happens with food, how digestion and disease states, very different than what I thought.
Yeah, very different, and very different than what a lot of dietetics is today. But it sounds like you ended up going in the clinical direction. So you were working in more hospitals, acute illness, maybe.
Yeah, well, my first experience when I was really unsure when I was in college is I volunteered at a hospital. I volunteered at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. And it was, just honestly, I have so much pride that I worked there because the whole staff, just the way that the hospital worked, really helping people, saving people, offering just so much care and so much hope. I worked on the nutrition support team, it was very, very clinical. This was actually part of my when I was volunteering. I would go around to different patients' charts and read through and then understand what was happening and explain it back to the doctors who were on the team. And we decided whether the person would have tube feeding or parenteral nutrition. So it was really very clinical. And that was the way that I entered into being a dietitian, was much more clinical than thinking about diets or food. It was really about helping people stay well, live longer, be able to fight their cancer treatments. Very different than what I hear from a lot of other dietitians starting in this field.
Yeah, it was much more a matter of survival than this chronic disease stuff that I think so many of us, myself, I'm 38. I started as a dietitian or, went back to school to become a dietitian 10 years ago. So that what attracted me to the profession then was this notion of chronic disease prevention and the quote unquote obesity epidemic and saving people from the ills of being fat, basically, and saving people from diabetes and heart disease that, of course, supposedly in my mind at the time were caused by being fat. And so it's a whole different ballgame, I think, when you start down the road to nutrition, as so many of us do now, from that perspective of thinking like body size is going to kill you.
No, absolutely. I entered the field being a dietitian in a way really to help save people from their treatments. And so it was a very different perspective, although certainly as I continued working in the field and was exposed to more diet culture messages, the work that I did very much shifted and became very much like what you're describing. You did. So yeah, we kind of all have the same story. If you're a dietitian long enough, you're going to be part of diet culture in some way. That's all there is to it.
Mm-hmm. You get sucked in.
You do. So, I was working at Memorial Sloan Kettering. They actually hired me. It was my first job out of college. They hired me after my internship and they gave me a job. And, I worked there for a while, again, just helping to save people from the perils of chemotherapy and really helping them survive longer. And there was a point that I just kind of, I don't know if I got tired of it or I wanted to try something different. And I figured I would go into sales and marketing. I ended up selling the nutritional products that I was using, like Ensure and Sustacal, like all those nutritional products. And so I did that for a while. It really moved out of patient care and sort of ended up moving into the field of public relations. I said I did a lot of different things as a dietitian starting out. And it was really there that my being a dietitian and diet culture merged because I was invited to work on accounts that really needed to have a dietitian. For example, I was involved in there was a whole light line of cheeses. I was responsible for sweet and low and artificial sweeteners. I was promoting them, writing background information. I was actually a media spokesperson going around talking about the wonders of these artificial sweeteners. So right in there with diet culture. And I think sort of the highlight of my being in diet culture was being on the account for when Oprah Winfrey famously went across the stage, lost all that weight. Yeah, and I was writing press releases and speaking the wonders of this diet. And, we know what happened, unfortunately, with Oprah.
Yeah, exactly. Very quickly after that, right? Within like 3 to 5 years, she had regained all that weight and said that she was at her heaviest weight. I actually did some research on Oprah for my book and was shocked to find that it was such a short span from lowest weight to heaviest weight and, feeling like such a failure. And it's such a stark illustration of how diets don't work and how the human body fights back against that kind of weight loss.
Oh my goodness, absolutely. And I think back and I have a little bit of shame around that. That was my job. That's what I did at that time. But, we only know what we know when we know it. So, I certainly learned my lesson, but it took me a long time to learn my lesson and see how diets don't work. And, there came a point that I started to feel very uncomfortable with the job that I was doing, working in public relations and promoting products that I didn't necessarily feel personally good about. And I did that for several years and eventually found my way back into patient care and doing sort of nutrition therapy for patients.
How did that kind of discrepancy start for you? Like, how did you start to feel icky about promoting some of those products?
I think it first started with even the first job that I had when I worked for a company called Mead Johnson, and I was selling not just adult nutritional products, but I was also selling baby formula. And I started to think to myself, here I am telling doctors all about the marvels of formula when I know as a dietitian that we want to be promoting breastfeeding. And so there was something in the back of my head that was saying, there may be a little bit of a disconnect here. And each job that I had, from working in sales and marketing to then going into public relations and this whole thing with it just started me seeing this is really not a healthy way to be in the world. And so, I had these like little red flags, but I wasn't paying attention to them. And I would say it took me a good 10 years to really listen to those red flags. Sometimes it just takes time to realize that what you're doing isn't really consistent with your values. And that's what I found, that I needed to find something that was really more consistent with who I was as a person.
I think that's so valuable for people to hear and understand too, just thinking about the mechanisms of diet culture and how it works, because public relations is such a huge part of it. I'm a journalist. That's my background. That's what I did for my first, 7 years of my career full time, and then continued to do as a dietitian as well. And like the amount of press releases and PR pitches that we get as journalists, that when I was first working as a journalist in like a lot of smaller magazines that didn't have a big budget, a lot of times PR people were the key to getting getting the samples of things or getting a free trip to a restaurant or, something like that so that you could cover what you wanted to cover. And so the relationship between journalists and PR people, I think, is very complicated and intertwined and sort of symbiotic. Like we need each other.
Oh my goodness. Yes, absolutely. Yes.
And that just makes people, I think, in, journalism and in PR so vulnerable to falling prey to diet culture and to sort of the like what sells, what people want to read and hear about.
Yeah, absolutely. You know what? I think back to that period of time and I feel a little bit used. There was a dietitian I had an undergraduate degree in nutrition from Cornell. I got my master's degree from NYU like you did. And there I was as a dietitian. And I know I went to several different PR firms and I was actually hired because of my specific knowledge of what happens in an institution. For example, how I was hired into one PR firm because of my knowledge of the baby formula industry and trying to sort of make our brand the preferred brand and how to get that into the hospitals. And so sort of knowing that stuff in the background that it's not that I was being used. Obviously, I felt that I was being used, but it was clever. I had firsthand knowledge of how this stuff works. And, that was another really big red flag. Like, hey, this is just not right. This is not who I am, selling products that I don't necessarily believe in.
And it's so interesting too, how that, it makes sense from like a capitalist perspective, I guess, that the industry would want dietitians who can sell the product based on their knowledge and where it feels more organic for them to sell it. But it's also so shady to think about that because dietitians are, in a sense, getting used like that. I can totally understand that perception because, it's being used for this, not just specific knowledge, but also the credentials and the sort of imprimatur of knowledge. And it's like the stamp of approval, like this is approved by a dietitian.
Absolutely. And it was the same thing for getting doctors on board. I remember that I did a specific product. We were selling a line of vitamins. And I mean, I have to say that, there are certain instances where obviously we need additional vitamins and minerals, and there's nothing wrong with that. And it was an interesting product. I was working on vitamin and mineral interactions and studying where there may be need for additional vitamins or mineral supplements when you're taking certain medications. And I just remember having one of my jobs was having to find doctors who were knowledgeable in the different areas and putting together the scientific panel. And so, yeah, it's sort of putting the stamp of approval on, hey, vitamins are good. These doctors say it's good. And, again, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with vitamins or minerals or any of the particular products I was selling. It's just the capitalist way of doing things. You have the health professional stamp of approval. And I think that's where we're starting to feel used in a way.
Because it's not responding to, like, if you started to feel like, oh, this particular formula or this particular vitamin isn't really great for various reasons, like you could then, if you weren't working for those companies, you could then respond by not recommending them to patients or helping patients understand the pluses and minuses or whatever. But when you're working for an organization whose job it is to push those things no matter what, it's like you are being used in a way as the spokesperson for that thing. And no matter how you feel about that thing, your job is to push it, which is very problematic. Yeah.
Yep. So I got myself out of there fast. I'm saying fast, but probably like 3 to 4 years. But, I'm glad to say that I've had that experience. And so I use it in everything that I do now. All of the previous experiences that I've had, all the jobs that I've had have really, taken me to the place where I am now. And I think I'm glad, relieved, lucky that I've evolved. And I think we all evolved as we keep doing this work.
I'm so grateful too for the work that I did in the past that similarly I was pushing diet culture in various ways, not knowing it, not knowing the harms of it, just being in my own disordered place and doing what I thought was right and doing what was rewarded by the institutions I was working for. And yeah, we can't know better until we know better, and then we do better.
That's right. That's right. After I realized that area, public relations, wasn't right for me, I ended up starting my private practice because I wanted to be back with my clients. I wanted to be back, quote unquote, helping people. And so I helped them by helping them lose weight. I'm embarrassed to say that, but that was one of my first jobs when I was starting my own private practice. Is I figured, hey, I'll help people stay healthy, just like we all did back in wellness culture. Just eat less, move more. And in fact, I became a personal trainer, and I had a whole business in my home, like sort of around my kids and their schedules. And I worked to help people get healthy. But as I know now, I unfortunately created people with disordered relationships to food and even eating disorders, whole families with eating disorders. So you can only know what you know. And I'm grateful I've been doing this long enough that I can see some of the people that I've worked with in the past have gotten to a place that they've made peace with food and their bodies. I think we all evolve. We're exposed to this wonderful new way of thinking with health at every size.
Yeah, it's really, it's so understandable that you would think that it's like, quote unquote, getting healthy to tell them to lose weight. And it's interesting too that like the first way that you started your private practice was weight loss. Because I think a lot of dietitians, when first starting a practice, that's what feels the most like, well, if I'm having a private practice, I have to offer weight loss. That's what people are going to be coming to me for. And that's the easiest thing to sell. And it's hard to see past that when you're first starting out.
I think it's impossible to see past that. It's just everything that's marketed to dietitians is about weight loss. And I'll just say something really interesting is I teach an intuitive eating program right now in my office, and it's for middle-aged women. And I have a new participant who came, and she found me by looking at the intuitive eating website, trying to find someone who does this work. And she realized I probably saw her 15 or 20 years ago and gave her a diet. So it's really, really came around. Wow. And it's like we just hugged each other. It's like, okay, we both know better. Let's do better. And she's working through intuitive eating. And it's just such a nice sort of circle that starting with weight loss and sort of ending up with, let's learn about intuitive eating and how our body really feels.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it really is amazing, actually, when I think about it.
How did you come to that place? How did you go from this private practice with weight loss to starting to work with eating disorders and intuitive eating and health at every size?
It was really very organic, meaning that as I did this work, as I helped people lose weight and they continued to come back with, I think about the scale, getting weight and not losing weight and getting upset. and weighing kids and working with kids who were in the quote unquote, I can't even say the word, the O word in that category. Just seeing the pain and suffering, it took me a while, over the course of a year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, really seeing people coming back that I just realized there had to be a different way, and this was back in the 90s, but really weren't talking about health at every size. It was out there, but it wasn't as prevalent as it is now. And I just started to read books and look for information, I'm saying online. We really didn't have the internet. I mean, I'm thinking, how did I get my information? I read it from books. It was the beginning of the internet. But I heard about this health at every size somewhere. I remember hearing about Lindo Bacon, and reading the book and just think, okay, this makes sense. And really kind of doing it on my own. I didn't really have mentors. I didn't really have role models, anyone to sort of show me my way. And I just did it myself. I just experimented with my clients, really talking about focusing on behavior change and not weighing them, not the scale. And I started to see happier people. And it's kind of the same thing with realizing when people started to have disordered eating behaviors, I realized, oh my goodness, this is just, I need to do something different. And I found consultation and assistance from therapists because there weren't dietitians that I knew doing this work. So I feel like I kind of made it up as I went along, really until the last 7 years when this information has just exploded. I feel like I did it a little bit underground,
I mean, I think that's so interesting and parallels so many people's experience, I think, as dietitians or other healthcare professionals, where you're doing diet culture's bidding, you're doing the thing you've been told you're supposed to do, and then seeing negative repercussions and thinking this can't be right, there has to be a different way. And I think that's kind of how a lot of us start seeing things differently and understanding, like, we can't keep doing this. Weight loss is not working and it's actually harming people.
Yeah, I think that's it. It's just seeing the harm and over and saying to yourself, no, there has to be a better way. Has to be a better way. So it's like a full circle. I've come full circle just like you have. Thank goodness.
Thank goodness for all of it. Yeah, I think it's really wonderful that we all kind of ended up in this place, and that now there's such a community of people doing this work and sharing resources and lifting each other up, and it's awesome. It's just growing.
I say, you know what? Thank goodness. I mean, as I say this, I get chills. Just having community, just having support, not feeling so alone makes doing this work so much richer. I feel blessed to have this wonderful community. So thank you, Christy. You're part of it. You're a big part of it.
Thank you. I'm so glad you're in this community too and doing this work. And
thank you.
Yeah, it's wonderful. I'm curious to talk a little more about your work with eating disorders and intuitive eating in midlife, because you said you have this new group that's happening and a new course that you're working on. And it just, I hear from so many middle-aged people that, and particularly women, I think, that are struggling with disordered eating around menopause and weight gain as they age, and just the messages that people get about aging, the ageist messages in this culture, that in the way it sort of gets tangled up with diet culture is just so problematic, and not enough people are talking about it. So I'm really glad you're starting to do this work. And I'm just curious kind of like what you've experienced in working with this population. What are some of the particular ways that diet culture tends to show up for people in midlife and beyond?
Well, it's so interesting. I've been doing this work, again, for a long time. And I think just because I'm getting older, I've seen so many young people with eating disorders. And it kind of started first with their parents, seeing the moms of these teens who were suffering with their eating disorders, really kind of having their own disordered eating, and my sort of working with them on trying to help them learn about intuitive eating, and realizing, my goodness, this population, this age group, midlife women who are having children going through this stuff, they're the gatekeepers. They're the ones who are really struggling. I'm telling you, as soon as I kind of had that realization, I started to see a lot more middle-aged, just in my practice, middle-aged women in particular. In addition to the ones who are parents, I have a large number of really very severely ill anorexic middle-aged women. And just having been restricting for so long, health concerns are even more severe as we get older. It's harder to bounce back from things. I think that we kind of say youth is wasted on the young in a way, because, just everything, all the problems that young people have, if, with disordered eating, just become that much worse in midlife. And things happen, our bodies change. I'm saying our bodies because it's my body. It's like truly has changed. And I kind of share that with all the people that I work with. is that just like adolescence is a period of time when our bodies change, and I keep thinking back to like 10-year-old Erica when like, I thought I was quote unquote FAT. I thought I was, and people told me that, but I was really in puberty. It's the same thing around midlife and menopause. And there's this period of time from, they say the perimenopause, which is the period of time prior to menopause, is like 3 to 5 years. First, I think it's even longer, where bodies, start to change because hormone levels start to shift, just like in adolescence. Estrogen levels and progesterone levels, they drop, they change, they shift. And so what happens during that period of time is that periods become abnormal, they become longer, shorter, heavier. And in addition to that, people gain weight around the middle. It just happens just like in puberty. I call menopause a second puberty. And I think people aren't really aware of that. Like all of a sudden, it's like, oh my God, my pants are getting tight. Why is that happening? It's sort of helping people hear that this is very normal and natural. And the period of time prior to menopause, which by the way, menopause is, we always use the term, but it's really just one day. One day, menopause is the day that a woman or a person with ovaries has been without a period for 12 months. And then everything beyond that is postmenopause. So it's really this whole time of life from midlife, from somewhere between 3 to 5 years prior to the end of the period, and everything after is all sort of what we call menopause. And bodies are changing, and things are happening in the body that we're not necessarily aware of, because when hormone levels shift, there are some issues that occur because estrogen is a very protective hormone. It keeps us moist, it keeps our bones strong, it keeps our heart strong. And as our levels shift and lower, we start to have things like more brittle bones, and really we're in need of more calcium and vitamin D. Things happen with our heart. And I'll just say on a personal note, I've never, ever had a health issue. And all of a sudden, I have elevated cholesterol. And it's because estrogen is protective and helps to keep the heart pumping strong. And then when our levels are reduced, these things all of a sudden are concerns. So things like heart health, bone health, there are changes, again, because of dryness. There are changes in vaginal secretions. We just become dry. And menopause really, it affects so many areas. It's particularly in body image because of this dryness. Intimacy is affected. And I think we don't talk about this. That's what I found. I'm post. It happened to me already. And I think another thing that happens is that when all of these changes occur, it's a time of life that women or anybody who has ovaries are really, life is tough when you're in the middle. I think to myself, I think about my kids when they were young, and then dealing with my aging parents. Sort of, we call this, the sandwich generation, but that's what's happening. There's all these stressors, the illness. I mean, thinking about friends and family members who might be dying. I mean, it's again, you don't think about this stuff when you're young, but when you start to be middle-aged, it happens. People that get sick, people maybe get cancer or get divorced or have all this stuff going on. So it's kind of like, again, like adolescence. It's like all these bodily changes are happening, and all this stuff is going on in a person's life. So, and I'm like, remember for myself, like, I don't think I even paid attention because I was so stressed out with all of my other life, goings on. So I just say all the power to you. I want people to know about this before it happens. I think that, knowledge is really power. And I get angry. I'm like quick to anger when I think about some of the things that happened to me. I think I didn't really have good health care during this period of time. And I want to encourage people to be able to talk about this and be able to get health care that's inclusive and helpful and not focused on weight. We didn't really talk about that yet, but that's a whole conversation.
Well, yeah, everything you're saying about, all the changes that are happening in your body, and then these life changes that are reminding you of your own mortality, basically. I can see how all of that would make people, and have seen it in my life too, of people I know in the generation ahead of me, like being so vulnerable to diet culture and wellness culture in that phase, and feeling like it's a matter of life and death, and that's how doctors, I think, often frame it. It's like, this is a matter of life and death. You have to, quote unquote, take care of yourself by losing weight, or you have to, cut out all these foods in order to take care of yourself. And I think people are so vulnerable, and yet nobody is really talking about it, that like, this is a particularly vulnerable time for people that diet culture preys upon them when they're at their most vulnerable. And our society, of course, makes people feel bad about aging, and especially people assigned female at birth and women, people who identify as women are like so pressured to maintain this youthful appearance and not look like they're aging or going through menopause. And there's so many natural changes that do happen in the body as a way to protect, like the weight gain around the middle. I've heard Margot Main call it the life preserver, right? That it's the way to keep estrogen levels from plummeting. And yet we're told to lose that weight and to make our bodies look like they never changed, which is just ridiculous.
Yeah, Christy, thank you so much for bringing that up, because that's really, I would say that's probably the most distressing symptom of all of menopause is the weight gain. And it is normal. It is natural. It happens because estrogen levels drop. And, as Margot Main talks about it as a life preserver, which I just love. It's, rather than a spare tire, because, hey, we get a spare tire around the middle, but it is protective. When the ovaries stop producing as much estrogen, the body looks for other sources. And the idea of having estrogen is that it just helps, it's cardioprotective. It protects our bones. It keeps us moist and supple. And so the body does everything to defend that. And so that's what, people have come to me and said, oh my God, I can't lose weight like I did when I was younger. It's like, yeah, you're not supposed to. And then the messages that you get everywhere, the messages from, I've been doing this research and looking at the position statements of various menopause associations. It's like they talk right away, first thing, do everything you can not to gain weight. That weight gain is going to cause X, Y, Z. And really, it almost makes you feel this is going to happen, doom and gloom, and you're going to die. It's really, what you said is true. It feels like life and death. It does. I've gained a weight around my middle. It's like, hey, what am I going to do? It's like, I can only do the best that I can do, which is to looking at health at every size and intuitive eating, to practice health promoting behaviors like moving because it feels good, eating foods that make my body feel good. And I say this to all my clients. I'm personalizing this, but this is really to everybody. Eat foods that taste yummy without being depriving. Take really good care. One thing what I found is that particularly women in my practice who've maybe are in larger bodies really shy away. Obviously, we know this from going to the doctor, because doctors, they're scary. The first thing they're going to do is tell you, get on the scale and weigh you and, X, Y, Z, do everything to lose weight. And we have to be so careful to be advocates for ourselves and to say, hey, I'm having X, Y, Z symptom. What would you tell someone in a smaller body? Because the first thing they're going to do is tell you to lose weight. It's really problematic. But I want to encourage people to feel like it's a good thing to go to the doctor, because there are these changes that happen and there are things that can help, which is a whole nother issue, talking about all these various untoward symptoms of perimenopause and menopause. It's not just weight gain, but it's things like hot flashes. I actually did like a poll, an online poll in a lot of different Facebook groups. So it wasn't just people who do health at every size, but sort of what are the most concerning symptoms that are happening in midlife. And honestly, other than weight gain, what I hear most consistently is these hot flashes and night sweats. And for some people, it's actually really debilitating, and mood swings. You think about adolescence and, particularly, with the people that we work with eating disorders, disordered eating backgrounds, there might be some history of some mood changes, depression, anxiety. Unfortunately, during this period of perimenopause, those symptoms can get worse. So it's important to be an advocate for yourself. And if you're really feeling uncomfortable, to go to the doctor and talk about it. There's been a lot of controversy about hormone replacement therapy, but I'll just say that it is the most proven, I don't want to say curative, but the thing that helps symptoms the most. And I think it's really important to be able to talk to your doctor about what's right for each person, whether it be bioidentical hormones or hormones that are made in the lab that a doctor prescribes. But that has to be done very carefully with your doctor. But, before that, I always try to tell people about some of the more natural, complementary type things that can help with symptoms. Things like, things that are in the category of intuitive eating, lifestyle change, things that are practical, like dressing in layers and having cool water available, people carrying their fans around, which is what I did. I always had a fan when I was having hot flashes. And it, I'll just say that I still have hot flashes. So I dress in layers, doing meditation, yoga. And then there are some nutritional supplements that can be helpful to people. Things like black cohosh, things like phytoestrogens. You might have heard about soy, some other supplements, vitamin E, flaxseed. Some of these supplements can help with the hot flashes, but I'll just say that when someone is really, really knee deep and really struggling, it's so important to talk to the doctor and see if some hormone replacement is appropriate. Again, that's something that we don't really talk a lot about. And no one told me, no one talked about it with me. I even think about this. I went to the doctor and it was never discussed with me. I know maybe I didn't bring up concerns, but I think knowledge is power. And the more that I learn about this, the more I want to empower other women or really anybody who has ovaries is going to go through this process to be able to talk about it and not be embarrassed. I think people feel embarrassed about the quote unquote changes, but it happens to everyone. It's normal, natural.
And people, I think, too, feel, they're embarrassed about taking medication. I think there's that piece of the wellness culture, the wellness diet in this day and age where people are made to feel like they're failures if they have to take medication for whatever reason, and that they need to be able to do it, quote unquote, naturally. And so if they try some of the more natural supplements and things and they're still having symptoms, they feel like they've done something wrong. And oftentimes, too, are sort of attracted to more and more restrictive diets and these ridiculous things, eliminating every food under the sun, thinking that's going to help when there's no actual evidence behind it, rather than talking to their doctor about hormone replacement therapy and knowing that that is an option and that doesn't make you a failure.
I think I might have been one of those people, I'm embarrassed to say, now that it's post menopause, I think that. And I just know for me, like my hormones, really my mood changes, my mood shifting and not sleeping, those were probably the biggest concerns I had. And I have to say, some women have to go on medication, antidepressants, and whatever. And again, there's no failure there. You're doing what feels best to get through this period of time, and it doesn't last forever. I'll just say that now it's been 5 years, and all what's sort of back to baseline. So it's this period of time that might feel really challenging, but we shouldn't be ashamed of asking for help. Absolutely, some people soar through this without any issues whatsoever. I think my mother was one of those, like, we never talked about it. I had no idea when this happened to her. But other people really suffer. Worth maybe talking with your family and kind of seeing what the history is like, how other people in your family, survived menopause.
Yeah, that's a great point, because people don't talk about it enough. It is considered this kind of shameful secret in our society that, nobody really wants to open up about. And I'm also thinking too, like when you're talking about all these changes that happen and the pressure on people to lose weight in order to combat like the cosmetic change of weight gain, sometimes people frame it, and definitely doctors frame it as like a health concern. Of course, diet culture these days loves to frame higher weight as a health concern, but really at the end of the day, we know that it's coming from diet culture and not just cosmetic, but like moral shaming of people in larger bodies and this value system of diet culture that says larger bodies are less valuable than smaller bodies, which is total bullshit, right? But
absolutely,
I think that there's that piece that is only exacerbating symptoms for people. If weight gain and extra fat around the midsection especially is protective and helps increase those estrogen levels and reduce the plummeting of it that can create symptoms, then trying to lose weight and being so obsessed about shrinking your body has to make symptoms worse.
It absolutely makes symptoms worse. It makes the mood swings worse. I believe that it really affects everything. It affects sleeping. It probably affects hot flashes too. I mean, I think that it's just really normal and natural to have some weight gain. And that's where, again, intuitive eating is just so important to point out that we may, as we're going through this period of time, perimenopause into menopause, I think sometimes hunger cues can be blunted by things like not sleeping enough. I mean, I'm just going to say stuff is going to happen. You're going to have a sleepless night. You're going to crave chocolate. Like, it's really okay. I think it's about normalizing that and saying it's really okay. You're going to do the best you can, and let's not get hysterical. If you gain, it's not the end of the world. It's really not. It's really not. It's protective, and let's just focus on getting through the day, getting through the week, getting through the year, and being the best you can.
Yeah, and I think too, like, this pressure on people to do things, quote unquote, right by diet culture standards means that any sort of craving or any sort of deviation from what they think is, quote unquote, good makes them feel like I'm not allowed to do intuitive eating. Like that's something that I hear from participants in my online course who are in midlife and beyond and going through menopause and peri or postmenopausal is that like, well, you wouldn't understand. There's all these things that happen when you're older that don't happen for younger people. And so I'm just not able to eat intuitively because I have all these additional cravings or I have all these things going on that make me not a candidate for intuitive eating or something.
Well, I'll just say that things do happen that affect cravings. And I think, again, it's part of the normal and natural progression of aging. And I just always really want to normalize it and say, this is the time of life you're in. You may not be sleeping. I can understand you didn't sleep, you're stressed out, but not to villainize it, not to demonize it, to really just say it's okay, it's normal, it's natural. You really can do intuitive eating. If you had a bad day and you craved something and you ate something maybe that you wished you hadn't, it's really okay. There's no mistakes in intuitive eating. Tomorrow is a new day. You get to start over. There's no mistakes, only learning experiences. What happened yesterday? What was going on in your life? Can we find some alternative ways of handling it? Things like meditation, which, I'll just say for me, I said this before, but I meditate now. I didn't when I really needed to. I didn't when I was younger. But it's really been very helpful. But not everyone is at that place and ready to, particularly people who are coming out of, maybe disordered eating, maybe not being so embodied. So I think we have to just give each other a break and really say, it's okay, we're doing the best we can. Definitely intuitive eating for the win. That's what I have to say.
Absolutely. And also, I think if people are coming out of disordered eating, which so many folks are, right, coming out of decades maybe of restrictive eating and trying to shrink their bodies and trying to eat less, it's very understandable and natural to have cravings. And it's going to be, that pendulum swing happens no matter what age you are, no matter what size you are, ethnicity or gender or anything else. It's pretty universal that we have a backlash against restriction. And it can feel scary when your body already feels out of control from menopause to add this additional layer of feeling kind of out of control around particular foods. But it's still the same process of unconditional permission to eat and making peace with food that allows you to feel eventually like in charge and cool and at peace around those foods rather than feeling like those foods are ruling you.
You're so right about that. I've seen that a lot in a lot of online communities when women are coming from a place of really restrictive eating, having this, really immense shock and shame around feeling so out of control around food and gaining weight in particular around the middle. And it's going to happen. And we have to stop being so afraid of weight and of fat. It's not a 4-letter word. People have body fat. We're allowed to have body fat. We need it. And I think that just constantly reminding people, you can do intuitive eating. You can learn to make peace with food. It doesn't happen overnight. And it is more challenging, I'll say, when you're older and you've been in restrictive eating mode for so many years. It is scary. And so sometimes having some support, having an intuitive eating coach like yourself, or like me, holding people's hands is very helpful, if someone needs the additional support, because it's scary, really scary.
And people need permission to go through it too. Like just you saying that and saying it's okay. We need to stop being scared of it. We need to stop stigmatizing fat and higher weights. Like I think people need to hear that again and again. And it's hard when you're in diet culture and have been in your own head for so long with this stuff to really trust, to really know that it's going to be okay and that you are allowed to eat whatever you want and that you are going to feel at peace with food one day.
I agree. I think it's really, we just keep reminding people and keep saying it over and over and having them hear the message. It's really going to be okay. It's hard to age. It's not just about our weight, but it's hard to age in this culture. I see some of my friends really sort of struggling, should they let their hair be gray? Should they have their hair gray grow out? It's scary. And wrinkles. I see so many people, thinking about, should I have cosmetic surgery? And it's certainly a personal decision, but it's all part of this culture of diet culture and youth culture. We should all look the same as we did when we were in high school or when we first got married. It just doesn't work like that. What about respecting your elders? What about the wisdom of elders?
That's been so erased in this culture. I feel it's been, older people are so marginalized and people in larger bodies are so marginalized. And, it feeds capitalism to do that, right? To marginalize people.
I totally agree. when I first came to doing online work, I've been sort of toiling in my own little office for a long time while I raised my kids. And all of a sudden I wanted to spread my message to a wider audience, and I started doing online work and, connecting with online communities, which honestly has been a godsend to just know that I'm not alone in the way that I think. But even when I first came to doing this online work, just seeing so many young people, it's exciting. I see myself in you. I see myself in all the young people out there doing this amazing work. But people who are older have life experiences, and it's important not to discount that. And it's kind of the same thing when a middle-aged or an older person, a woman comes to your office, comes to ask for help with intuitive eating, to really listen to them and really respect where they're coming from, because they have experiences that a young person doesn't have. And I think it's important just to let them talk, let them share where they're coming from. I think that's really important when they're, sort of younger practitioners who might be working with someone who's a little bit older.
Yeah, that's such a good point, that the wisdom of that lived experience is really valuable, and that we need to, just as we listen to people in larger if we're a professional within privilege and we don't have the experience of living in a larger body, we need to listen to and validate the experiences people talk about of living in a larger body in the society, and the difficulty of that, and the particular, nuances of having to move through the world in a larger body. Also, we need to listen to all of the different experiences people have, including being older and the nuances with that.
Absolutely. One side effect of menopause I did not mention, I probably should have, is brain fog. And so I'm going to just put that in quotations because it almost sounds like a dirty word. I've actually had moments where I'm sitting with my patients, and I tell you, I just look at them and I forget what I said. I forget where I lost my train of thought, can't come up with a word. And I just say, thank God many of my clients are older. We just look at each other and laugh. But I could actually see that a younger provider perhaps having a different thought, like, oh my God, what just happened? But we lose words. It's part of getting older. It's this sort of brain fog that comes over middle-aged people, middle-aged women, and is part of the menopause process. And so I'll just say being respectful. I think that's what I want to say. Respect.
That makes so much sense. And also, I think respect for ourselves when we go through that. I'm eventually going to go through that. Everyone listening is either there or going to go through it, right? Hopefully.
It will happen.
Knock on wood, if we're lucky enough to get to that point, right?
That's right.
And not everyone listening has ovaries, so we'll say that. But everyone listening is going to get to a point, no matter their gender or sex assigned at birth, where they have missing words and, the symptoms of aging, right? But
yes,
we're all going to get to a place where we lose things, we have brain fog. And I think that knowing that also is really important to counter the wellness culture pressure, because brain fog is I was obsessed with brain fog back in the day when my brain fog was actually caused by not eating enough and overexercising, and didn't want to admit that, or didn't acknowledge that, didn't have anyone else validate that. And so was looking for other causes of the brain fog, thinking that it was, gluten or dairy or what other food can I cut out to try to eliminate this brain fog. And I think the wellness diet preys upon that. And I think we all, to some extent, have moments where we're not as mentally clear as we'd like to be, right? I've definitely had that with my thyroid condition, or with just being super busy and exhausted at certain points. And I think the tendency and the pressure in this youth worshiping culture and sort of productivity worshiping culture too is to say, oh, if you have brain fog, if you have moments where you lose your train of thought, that's not right. You should do something to fix that. And here are all the foods you're supposed to cut out to do that. Or here's this weight loss plan that'll help you do that. And so recognizing that that's actually a false standard, and people should not be held to that standard, that we all are going to have moments like that. And as we age, those moments might occur more frequently, and that's okay. That's part of life. That's not something you need to go on a restrictive diet to try to address.
Oh my goodness, absolutely. You brought up two things that I want to mention. One is you talked about your thyroid, and I just want to say that another important reason to actually get some medical care, if you're fortunate to have access to medical treatment, is to make sure as you're getting older, and if you are experiencing some of the symptoms that I've mentioned of perimenopause, is that to see if your thyroid is functioning well. And I'm not talking about going to a naturopath who just says, yeah, there's something wrong with your thyroid, but make sure that you're well, that your thyroid is working adequately. because some of the symptoms will mimic the perimenopause symptoms. So I just wanted to make sure I was clear about that. But oh my God, this brain fog. Brain fog, it is a symptom of restriction. I have someone I'm working with who can just, she can just tell me, I didn't eat enough for breakfast. And I remember, I couldn't talk in my meeting. It's like, yeah, you didn't eat enough. But the actual brain fog is a side effect. I'm looking at, I wrote them down, all the side effects that happen with perimenopause, and that is one of them.
So it's complicated, right? It can be tangled up with restriction, but also there's a piece of it that might be physiological from the menopause. And
absolutely, yes. So I just think that knowledge is power. Again, I've said that many times, but we don't always have to attribute various changes to wellness culture. Things just happen in our bodies. It's okay.
How do you recommend people go about getting medical care that is compassionate and HAES aligned and anti-diet, where someone's not going to put the patient on an elimination diet to try to address the brain fog, but that's actually going to listen to the person's symptoms and prescribe what needs to be prescribed and not intervene in situations where intervention is not necessary?
Can I just say, I knew you were going to ask that question. And I'll just say, I wish I had a brilliant answer. I wish I did. Menopausal symptoms, there are practitioners who are registered with the North American Menopause Association, but I really think that the best way to get recommendations is to ask colleagues, to ask friends, to ask your providers, because there unfortunately are so many doctors out there who are not HAES aligned. I'm in New York, you're in New York. I'm embarrassed to say that I don't know that many people to send my clients to.
I don't either.
It's terrible. So it's about really asking experiences. I have, for example, I have several of my clients who are in larger bodies, and I write down the names of their doctors when they've been to visits and they've come back and they've been positive. I write the name of their doctors down, and that's kind of how I do it. So I would say, I'm almost embarrassed to say this, but word of mouth is probably the best way, if someone's had that experience. And if not, I love what Regan Chastain has. She has this wonderful printout of things to say at your doctor, particularly if someone is coming from a background of an eating disorder, to really be able, and even if you can't say it, you could hand them something that says, I don't want to be weighed. I don't want recommendations that are about weight loss. I want you to tell me what you would tell someone in a small body. That's what I would suggest, is that sort of thinking about that in advance and going armed with the information. I wish I had a better answer. I'm sorry, I don't.
No, it's okay. I mean, I honestly ask myself that question all the time too. And people ask me that question at speaking events and stuff. And I'm just like, it's the same thing. I'm like, I don't have a great list. I mean, there's certainly those directories online. There's HAEScommunity.org. And I have a list on my website, christyharrison.com/providers. But it's like, my list is very small and curated. And it's like people I've had on the podcast that I trust. And the HAEScommunity.org list was started by Linda Bacon. And, initially I think was people who were really aligned with the HAES values and took the HAES pledge. And now there's tens of thousands of people in there. So who knows how aligned it is. And I've definitely seen, just kind of poked around in there and looked at some people's websites who took the pledge. And I've seen weight loss on the website of the provider who supposedly is pro-HAES. So it's like very catch as catch can, very tricky to find someone who really is fully HAES aligned. And I think you're right that just like being armed with things to say to them to make sure that you're getting HAES and weight inclusive care. And also being ready to maybe have to interview a bunch of different doctors, maybe have to go to a doctor, see how you feel, see what the relationship is like. If you don't like them, try to find someone else and go through your list of potential providers. Obviously that is expensive. It's time consuming. There's, insurance may not, depending on the insurance plan you have, you may be assigned a primary care provider. And so you might have to go through the process of signing up for a different primary care provider. And all of that can be really challenging. In the US, especially, healthcare is not easy. So
I would agree. Yeah. I mean, I don't exactly know what happens in other countries. I hope it's better, but I say, for starters, I went to a doctor's office the other day and I look at this. I did not see seating that was accessible. I mean, and that's just a red flag right there. So, if you can, even if you can't get yourself to the doctor, call ahead. You can call ahead and maybe find out what the office is like, if there is accessible seating, even as a sort of a first start.
Yeah. It tells you a lot about a provider's values too. If they don't think to provide accessible seating, they probably aren't going to think to provide accessible care either. And actually, I will say that the doctor, obviously I'm in a smaller body, I have thin privilege, so I'm not experiencing doctors the way that someone in a larger body would. But I do refuse to be weighed at the doctor's office as both a stand for taking a stand against using weight as a measure of health, and also for my own self-care, just to, I don't think I would be triggered by it at this point, but just to make sure that I'm fully insulated from that diet culture trigger. I don't want to see it or step on it or be anywhere near it. So I refuse to be weighed. And the doctor's offices where that's gone over well and it's not been a thing have all had accessible seating. And the ones that where it hasn't gone over well and where it's become a fight, well, I can think of only a few, but that they haven't. So I think that's an interesting clue, actually.
Absolutely. I have to say the same thing. I, as a rule, don't want to get weighed. Honestly, I don't really care what the number is. I don't think I want to see the number. And I have gained weight through menopause. I'm actually in a sort of a smaller fat body, but it's not a thin body. And so I do experience some of this issue about the notion of losing weight. I've had a discussion most recently with a provider, and I'm just, really, I am so clear. This is how I practice health at every size. We're not talking about weight loss. We're going to talk about behaviors, and just to really be so clear on that.
How has it gone over for you when you've talked to doctors about that?
It's almost, I'm embarrassed to say this, but I get really anxious beforehand. But I do. It goes over well because I'm so clear. I think if you're really clear about the boundary, you're in a much better place. And that's it, just being clear.
It's also really nice that you share you get nervous too, because so many people do. And you're a professional who's been doing this work for decades. So like the fact that you are still nervous, I think speaks to.
Oh my goodness. I just going to say, I went to a cardiologist recently because as it turns out, through menopause, my cholesterol is high for the first time in my life. And I'm addressing that through some either lifestyle changes or I may have to be on medication. And I do get nervous. And I did notice that the provider was in a very, very small body. But I feel like I have to, since I'm capable of speaking for myself and advocating, I want to do that for other people. So the same thing, I'm making a list of any doctor that I see that I think listens. I'm making making a list, checking it twice. They're good by my book. So thank you for asking.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing all of that and just all of your wisdom. It was so great talking with you.
Oh, well, thank you.
Can you tell us where people can find you and learn more about all of your work?
Oh, absolutely. I have a website. It's www.ericaleon.com. And I am excited. I'm working on an online intuitive eating program that's specifically for midlife and menopause, because I think that this is an area where people going through this really want to have the camaraderie of others. That's what I've noticed, because I'm doing a program like this in my office. And I just have to say the comfort level of people sharing these lived experiences, it's like nothing I've ever seen. I actually get the chills as I talk about it. Look forward to be happening on Thursday nights. And I teach this course with another person who went through intuitive eating, who did exactly all the things that we've described. And she's a social worker and we teach it together and it's a lot of fun. So I'm taking that and making it into an online course. And that's going to be happening sometime at the end of March, early April. But there's all kinds of information about it on my website, and I'm on social media. I do have a wonderful menopause handout that people can access. And that's on my website at ericaleon.com/menopause. Very easy. And lots of information about menopause and the course that will be coming up.
Oh, I love it. We'll put links to all that in the show notes so people can find it. And
thank you.
Yeah, definitely want to recommend everybody check out your course because it sounds like such a great resource.
Yeah, I'm excited. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. It's such a pleasure talking with you.
Oh, same thing so much. Thank you, Christy, for everything you've said and everything that you do.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So that is our show. Thanks again so much to Erica Leon for joining us on this episode, and thanks to you for listening. If you're looking for some practical tips to help you get started on the anti-diet path, grab my free audio guide, 7 Simple Strategies for Finding Peace and Freedom with Food. Just go to christyharrison.com/strategies to get it. That's christyharrison.com/strategies. If you've gotten something out of this podcast, please help us reach more people who need to hear the anti-diet message by sharing this episode and subscribing to the pod on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. You can see all the platforms to subscribe at christyharrison.com/subscribe. That's christyharrison.com/subscribe. And I'd love it if you could also leave us a nice rating and review in your podcast provider of choice, because that helps get the word out about the podcast, and I just so appreciate it. To get full show notes from this episode, including all the resources we mentioned, plus a full transcript, go to christyharrison.com/240. That's christyharrison.com/240. And to get the transcript, just scroll down to the bottom of the page and enter your email address. This episode of Food Psych was brought to you by my book, Anti-Diet: Reclaim Your Time, Money, Well-Being, and Happiness Through Intuitive Eating, which is now available wherever books are sold. Just go to christyharrison.com/book to order it now. And if you've already read and loved it, thank you so much. And I would be so grateful if you left a nice review on Amazon or Goodreads. A big thanks to our editor and sound engineer, Mike Lalonde, our community and content associate, Vinci Chue, and our administrative assistant, Julianne Watasik, for helping me out with all the moving parts that go into producing this show every week. Our album art was photographed by Abby Moore Photography and designed by Melissa Alam. Our theme song was written and performed by Carolyn Pennypacker Riggs. And I'm your host and producer, Christy Harrison. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, stay psyched.